This week, we're shifting gears to look at a new type of market structure, which is the monopoly. And up until now, we've talked about perfect competition where there are many firms, identical products, and no one business has control over price. And so a monopoly is the complete opposite. It's where one firm dominates the entire market, controlling both the product and the price. And in this lesson, we'll look at what makes monopolies unique, how they form, how they set prices, and why economists say they're inefficient compared to competitive markets. We'll also look at real-world examples like Hawaiian Electric and Google Search to see how monopolies can exist in practice, sometimes naturally and sometimes through market power. And so let's take a look about what really defines a monopoly. First, a monopoly is when one big firm dominates the entire market. Usually it's the only producer or seller of a product or service, so consumers don't really have any other options. Second, monopolies usually sell unique products, so things that don't have close substitutes. And that means that the company has a lot of control over what it sells and how much it charges. And that's because people can't easily switch to something else. Third, there are high barriers to entry, and these might include things like patents, government regulations, owning a key resource, or just the huge cost of starting up. And all of these make it really difficult for new competitors to enter the market. And finally, monopolies are called price makers. And since they're the only seller, they get to set the price rather than take the market price. They can adjust their output or how much they produce to help maximize their profits. And so overall, a monopoly is just about control. Control over the market, over prices, and sometimes even over consumer choice. So when we talk about monopoly, one of the clearest indicators is market share, or how much of the market one firm controls. And so a firm with a very high share can exert power over rivals, customers, and pricing in a way that firms with small shares can't. And so let's take a look at Google Search as a real-world case. And Google controls about 89 to 90% of the worldwide search engine market. And this dominance in search means that when people go to Google, they often don't even consider other options. And because so many users stick with it, especially as the default on browsers and devices, Google holds an enormous share of the search traffic. And that kind of share gives Google the ability to be a price setter. It can negotiate exclusive deals and also maintain barriers to entry for competitors. For example, Google has made agreements so that many devices and browsers set Google as the default search engine, making it harder for rivals to gain user adoption. In antitrust proceedings that we'll learn later on, courts have recognized that Google's dominant position in search and search advertising is tied to its very large market share, along with the barriers it maintains. And so just in sum, monopoly and market share generally go hand in hand. And so when one firm has control of a large share of the market, especially when that share is sustained over time, it has power over competition, pricing, and innovation in that sector. Now let's take a look at a natural monopoly. And so a natural monopoly happens when one company can meet all the market's demand more efficiently than having several competitors. And this usually occurs in industries that need massive infrastructure like utilities, water, or electricity. And in these cases, it just wouldn't make sense or be cost effective to have multiple companies building the same systems. And here in Hawaii, Hawaiian Electric is a great example. It provides electricity to most of the islands, Oahu, Maui, and Hawaii Island. And if several companies each tried to build their own power plants, transmission lines, and electrical grids, costs would skyrocket and the system would become inefficient. And so that's why Hawaiian Electric operates as what's called a regulated monopoly. And the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission oversees it, and it sets rules about pricing and service quality to protect consumers while still allowing the company to cover costs and earn a fair return. But overall, Hawaiian Electric shows how a natural monopoly can actually make sense, providing reliable service to the entire community at a lower overall cost than if there were multiple smaller competitors. And so just like last week and perfect competition, monopolies also have their own graphs. When we draw a monopoly graph, it's important to remember that most of what we've learned so far still applies. The overall structure should look familiar because the cost curves are still the same. We still have your marginal cost, your average total cost, and the average variable curves. In this case here, we don't have an AVC, but you'll see it in later graphs. The big difference is mainly on the revenue side. Here we'll notice that a monopoly faces a downward sloping demand curve, which also means that its marginal revenue curve lies below the demand curve. So notice here our marginal revenue is below our demand curve. And this happens because to sell more units, the firm has to lower the price, and that reduces additional revenue for each unit sold. But here's a key point. Even though the demand side looks different, so it's downward sloping instead of horizontal, the profit maximizing rule stays the same, where your firm or a firm should always produce where your marginal revenue intersects or equals your marginal cost. So that's where the profit is maximized or losses are minimized, just like before. And don't forget that the shutdown rule also still applies. So if the price, or in this case, if the monopoly's demand at the chosen quantity is below the average variable cost, the firm should shut down in the short run. And so now that we've identified the monopoly's cost and revenue curves, let's talk about how it actually decides the price and quantity that will maximize profit. And so the monopoly starts just like any other firm. It looks for the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that point tells us how much the firm should produce. So here at the intersection of our marginal cost and marginal revenue curves, that is a quantity of 6. But here's where monopolies are different from perfectly competitive firms. So in perfect competition, firms are price takers. They don't get to choose their price. It's set by their market. A monopoly, on the other hand, is a price maker. And so once it finds the quantity where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost, it goes straight up to the demand curve to find the highest price consumers are willing to pay for that specific quantity. And that point on the demand curve becomes the monopoly selling price. And so again here, let's take a look at this. If we go to where MC equals MR, that's a quantity of 6. And at the quantity of 6, if we go straight up to where it hits our demand curve and over to the left, here we have a price of $7. So 7 is what the monopoly is going to charge at a quantity of 6. And so again, this is a key distinction. So with perfect competition, the price comes from the market and firms adjust quantity. With monopolies, quantity comes from where MR equals MC, and then price comes from the demand curve. And so because of this, monopolies usually charge a higher price and produces a smaller quantity than perfectly competitive markets. And so this creates market inefficiency, what we call deadweight loss. And that's because some consumers who would have bought the other product at a lower price are now left out. And so the biggest takeaway here is that the monopoly maximizes profit where MR equals MC and then goes up to the demand curve to set the price consumers will pay at that quantity. And so let's take a look at this example here. So here we have our marginal cost, marginal revenue, we have our demand curve, also our average variable cost curve, as well as our average total cost curve. So when calculating this, the first thing we want to do is to calculate your total revenue. Remember that for total revenue, it's going to be the profit maximizing quantity times the monopoly's profit maximizing price. So our marginal cost curve intersects with our marginal revenue curve here at a quantity of 10. So 10 is our profit maximizing quantity. Then we're going to go up to our demand curve at that quantity of 10. And this gives us a profit maximizing price for the monopoly of $9. So $9 times 10 gives us a total revenue of $90. As for total cost, still at our quantity where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, we're going to go all the way up to where this quantity hits our average total cost curve. And so here at a quantity of 10, notice that that price is $10. So $10 times a quantity of 10 gives us a total cost of $100. And in this case, when we calculate profit or loss, we take the total revenue and subtract total cost. And here we have a loss of $10. Okay, let's go back to talking about why monopolies are inefficient before we take a look at more graphs. They're inefficient because they charge higher prices, and as I mentioned earlier, they don't produce enough output. And so they do produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but the efficient point for society is actually where your price equals marginal cost. And since monopoly price is higher than marginal cost, they're not allocatively efficient, which means that they don't make enough of what people actually want at a fair price. And so they're also not what's called productively efficient. And that's because they don't produce at the lowest point on your ATC curve. And without competition pushing them to lower costs, they operate with higher expenses and less pressure to improve. So in short, monopolies tend to overcharge, underproduce, and sometimes they even waste resources, which again, it leads to deadweight loss for society. Okay, let's go back to some graphs here. Here we can see at our marginal revenue intersecting at our marginal cost. Our monopolists, so QM is for the monopoly, QPC would be for the quantity that a perfectly competitive firm would produce. Okay, so a monopolist will produce less. In this case, they're going to produce at this quantity here, whereas a perfectly competitive firm, we would look where our demand curve intersects our marginal cost curve. And so this quantity is greater than if it were a monopolist. Also notice that the price at which a perfectly competitive firm is lower than the price at which a monopolist would charge. Okay. And so I talked a little bit about deadweight loss. So in a perfectly competitive market, both consumer surplus and producer surplus are maximized, and that's because the market produces at the efficient point where price equals marginal cost. And so buyers and sellers are both getting the most possible benefit from every transaction. But when a monopoly takes over, things change. And so, as I mentioned, monopolies tend to underproduce and overcharge. And so they sometimes intentionally restrict output so that they can raise prices. And as a result, consumer surplus goes down because buyers have to pay more and some consumers drop out of the market entirely. At the same time, producer surplus increases since the monopoly earns more profit on each unit sold. But here's the catch. That extra gain for the producer doesn't fully make up for what society loses overall. And so the total surplus actually shrinks. And the lost value, where potential transactions could have benefited both consumers and producers, doesn't happen. And so that is called deadweight loss. And that's illustrated in this triangle area here. And so just to summarize, in perfect competition, consumer surplus and producer surplus are maximized, whereas in monopoly, consumer surplus falls, but producer surplus rises, and total surplus drops. And again, this little missing piece of total surplus is the deadweight loss, which represents the inefficiency that monopolies create in the market. So a little while ago, I mentioned the term allocative efficiency. And so here we're going to talk about some price. So does price equals marginal cost? For a monopoly, it doesn't, and that's because, remember, for a monopolist, they're going to look to see where your marginal cost and marginal revenue curve intersect, but they're going to produce and price up where the demand curve hits. And so in this case, that is a price of $7. So price in this case does not equal marginal cost because the monopoly is actually underproducing. As for productive efficiency, we want to see, does price equal the minimum average total cost curve at MC equals MR? So if we take a look at our marginal revenue and marginal cost curves, here it intersects at a quantity of 6, but our average total cost curve is here, and the minimum point is just about here. So they're not producing at the lowest cost, which is the minimum of your average total cost. And so again, I cannot stress it enough, especially when you get ready for the next exam. Remember that for monopolies, although where your MC equals MR, we use that quantity, make sure when you're calculating price that you go up to the demand curve for that profit maximizing price for a monopoly.